So we've just released a report today looking at a decade of spending on climate finance through multilateral funds. So these are really the money that's attached to the Climate Change Convention and money that we expect to be making a difference in dealing with mitigation, adaptation, forestry issues. And the messages are really quite interesting. I think firstly to say that spending has actually been very slow to get up and running. We've only seen rapid increase in the last 2 or 3 years. That's the first one. Secondly, that the money that we're seeing flowing is going to the right places. They're going to big, rapidly developing countries who've got great potential for mitigation, and to countries that are very vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. So that's good news. But what's bad news is there's a huge concentration of that money. There's a lot of countries missing out, countries who need it missing out, countries that maybe we would say are maybe a little bit more risky to invest in. They're just not getting the money. But what the report's also focused on is what's really been achieved. Have we been seeing the funds working in a way that we would expect them to work? In transparency, in investing in the right things, in taking risks, in providing guarantees and loans and grants to the right things. And largely we say, there's a process of improvement there. But we've now got big challenges ahead of saying what can we learn from the last 10 years and what can we instruct the GCF or others like the GCF and other funding flows. How can we make sure that we don't have to restart those lessons? And that's what really the aim of the report is.
The UN admitted in a report they released last week that they still have no definition of what climate finance is. So when you're putting together a report like this, how do you define something that even the UN can't agree on?
Well, ODI has been tracking funding for climate change, which we actually specifically define as the funds that are channeled through multilateral climate funds. And so these are things like the Global Environment Facility, mechanism for the Convention, the Adaptation Fund, also the Climate Investment Facility in the World Bank, and now the GCF will be starting soon. So this is quite a narrow pool of finance if you think of it compared to pension funds and capital markets, equity. So it's a tiny part, but I think what the big difference is here, this is the money attached to the convention that builds trust in the negotiating room. And so this is the money that when the negotiators come to the table, they talk about the pledges that they've made, and it's the very tangible contributions and the commitments that potentially unlock progress. And so that's why our report looks at the funds that matter inside the negotiating hall and tries to build a different perspective, that it's not just about volumes, it's about what they're achieving. You can have £10 billion, you can spend it incredibly badly and get no results. And our idea is let's make sure we focus on what really matters, and that's the results that are achieved.
It's interesting you said that some of the countries that have benefited most are ones like Morocco, Mexico, Bangladesh, and maybe Ethiopia too. These are all countries that people always talk about as being, ideal models. What is it about these countries that makes them so successful in terms of attracting finance? And also, who makes the decision to send the money there? Because presumably the money comes in to some kind of holding pen or a multilateral bank, and then do countries apply for it, or do they get chosen? How does that work?
Yeah. Okay, well, the first thing to say is that it's a country-driven process. So countries will be applying for money, they'll be making proposals, they'll be contacting those in the funds, and the difference is that, to actually unlock the big money, it takes leadership. It takes leadership, it takes confidence, it takes trust, it takes a certain amount of managing risk of that money, and it takes good ideas. And so the countries that have been successful are the countries that have shown good leadership. They've got a plan in place, they've consulted the key stakeholders, they've talked to the banks, they've talked to the project developers, and they put a proposal on the table. And we call this kind of investment grade projects. The problem that we've got, of course, is that not every country in the world has got a highly functioning government. There's a lot of vulnerable people living in weak countries with weak states where it's not the first thing on their mind to think about applying to multilateral climate funds, and they miss out. So the question we have to say is, well, how do we modify the delivery model for our climate finance that allows us to direct it to the poor people in the poor countries with weak governments who need it most?
And one of the mechanisms for doing that, people say, is the Green Climate Fund, the GCF, which is supposed to allow developing countries more access to these funds and make it easier, maybe cut out some of the bureaucracy. Yeah. A lot of people from the ODI seem to be involved in some of the Green Climate Fund talks. I mean, are you seeing enough as it stands for that to really make a fundamental difference? Forget for a second how much money's been sent in so far. In terms of the actual governance structures, are you happy?
I think the Green Climate Fund is actually taking some really reassuring steps forward. It's early days, of course. Green Climate Fund's not spent anything really yet, and so we've got to make sure, though, that we start out on the right path. Where the signs are encouraging, though, is that the Green Climate Fund are offering resources to countries for readiness, and so to begin the process of identifying which agency, which entity in the country is going to be the entity that gets direct access. So the one that is the channel, the mobiliser, the intermediary to country level. Now, the process of support is in place. There's lots of people around working with countries to build their readiness. Still, the question is, though, what about those countries that are not ready to nominate their national implementing entity or don't have one that stacks up? You know, it's still a process of accreditation where we would need to see the entity does everything that they can to manage financial risk and corruption and, you know, all the kind of audit stuff that we need to see to ensure the money is being spent well. And so we've still got a little bit of a gap there, where, you know, some of the, let's take a South Sudan or a Somalia, or, you know, these countries are not going to be the ones that are engaging first. But it's going to take time. Green Climate Fund, I think, have learned key lessons in that regard, are willing to take a little bit more risk at this stage, and I think, you know, certainly started off well. But, you know, within a year, we're going to need to start asking harder questions of the Green Climate Fund of, you know, are they spending quickly? Are they dispersing quickly? And is it making a difference? And that's what our report's trying to highlight, that the questions should be focused on.
And you said you'd focused in the report a lot on some of those big multilateral institutions. What about the scenario outside those? There's a lot of focus at the moment on green bonds. There's a lot of focus on whether pension funds can perhaps focus on more climate-friendly. Do you see real potential there? Is the ODI, is that an area you guys are going to focus on?
Yeah, so we've certainly got a team at ODI that are looking at private climate finance and broader flows. This report does focus on those convention funds, and, you know, the volumes there are not enough to solve the problem. It's a tiny amount of money when you compare it to bonds and to pensions. What it does, though, as I've said already, is it builds trust. What it also does is it provides leveraging opportunities. It gives a signal to the market that we're serious. It provides an opportunity to give a little bit of a risk guarantee where there are, you know, pension fund investors may start to squirm in some of the projects that could be invested in. But the big game in town, of course, is moulding the $6 trillion that kind of flows in the financial system to make sure every dollar of that is climate smart. And I think, you know, this report highlights that there's a lot of work to do to shape that. But the big game in town, of course, is those big financial institutional investors. And the signs are, I think, that we're starting to see them recognise that the market is shifting. Returns on clean energy projects are improving and are there for the future. And we're seeing this shift in the market. So I think the signs are positive. But of course, in the convention, we need to see very clear signals given to the market. And that'll be vital for the future of multilateral institutions in this area as well.
One final question. There was a lot of focus last week on a story that came out about Japan's financing of some coal plants in Indonesia, and it had placed it underneath its climate finance obligations, and it said, we are investing in lower emission coal plants. What clarification do you think is needed ahead of Paris next year so countries and investors understand what is climate finance and what isn't? And do you see a place for investments in more energy efficient coal plants?
Well, it's a good question. Firstly, I would say that I certainly, from an ODI perspective and from a personal perspective, would not condone investing in coal plants, whether they're slightly cleaner or not. I just don't see that being the transition we need. But in terms of the wider signals, the convention and the process here needs to make some choices about what we're aiming to. We've just held an event over the last 2 days called 0-0, which is zero poverty, zero emissions. And with a focus of the fact that needs to be within a generation if we're going to actually secure a life of dignity for all. And so I think if the convention here and the negotiations here can send a message that says, actually what we need to achieve is net zero greenhouse gas emissions as soon as possible if we're going to avoid catastrophic climate change, then it gives a message to the markets and to investors that continuing to invest in fossil fuels it's a bubble. You know, we have a fossil fuel bubble now, and the market, I think, is slowly beginning to recognise that. We're seeing the signs, and it's disappointing that countries like Japan can think that they can get away with this kind of approach.